The world knew him as the ultimate monster in the shadows, a natural giant who could crush a man's spirit with a single, terrifying look. But before he was a Hollywood icon, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. was a broken, isolated boy in the war zone of Compton, hiding behind dark glasses to conceal a curse that made him a target for every predator in the neighborhood. Born blind in his right eye due to a deformed retina, Tommy Lister Jr. grew up in a darkest hour of absolute self-loathing, literally hating the God he believed had scarred him for life. He was the child who was chased home daily by bullies, a boy whose own parents spoke death upon his name, telling him he was a freak who would never amount to anything. Yet, in a staggering turning point that defies all human logic, that very same cursed eye would become his $1 million trademark, a utopian blessing that powered a career of over 250 acting credits and made him a permanent, haunting fixture in the history of global cinema. The utopian experience of Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr.'s career is a paradox of staggering, almost unbelievable proportions. On screen, he was America's favorite bully, a powerhouse who worked with everyone from the legendary Marlon Brando to the revolutionary Tupac Shakur and the action hero Bruce Willis. He was the only man on Earth who could realistically stand toe-to-toe with Hulk Hogan as the human wrecking machine known as Zeus. His cultural footprint was so massive that he was immortalized in 3 different toy action figures, appearing in blockbusters that grossed billions of dollars worldwide. But behind the big voice and the intimidating 6'5" frame was a gentle giant who lived in a state of constant spiritual warfare and emotional neglect. He was a man who eventually had to perform the ultimate turning point by cutting off his own mother and father to survive their toxic disbelief, clinging only to the prayers of his grandmother while he fought to prove that a blind boy from the streets of Compton could actually conquer the world of Hollywood. However, this investigation reveals that the broken shield of his success was constantly under attack from forces both internal and external. Despite his prestigious status as an NCAA national champion and a beloved entertainer, Tommy Lister Jr.'s life was a series of violent and unpredictable turning points. He grew up in an era where his high school was so dangerous that 13 people were hit in a single shootout, and teachers had to carry guns for survival. Later, at the height of his fame, he faced the terrifying moment where the local police pulled him over and threatened him because he had grown too powerful and wealthy for the racial establishment of the time. He lived on the edge of a knife, a man who commanded absolute fear on the movie screen but felt the cold, sharp grip of a darkest hour every single time the cameras stopped rolling. He was a natural giant who achieved everything the world said he couldn't, only to find himself entangled in a massive federal fraud case that threatened to strip away every penny and every ounce of dignity he had spent 30 years building. The silent scream of Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. reached its final tragic crescendo during the lonely months of the global pandemic. After surviving the literal war zone of Compton and the cutthroat, predatory politics of Hollywood, the man who seemed physically invincible was brought to his knees by an invisible, microscopic enemy. The final turning point of his journey is a haunting and deeply somber tale of a man dying alone in his apartment, too physically weak to even call for medical help, while his managers and friends watched from a distance as his once booming voice faded into a whisper. As we examine the life of the man who played DeBo, Zeus, and the President of the Galaxy, we are forced to ask, how did a man so big become so small and forgotten in his final hours? This is the raw, unfiltered investigation into the triumphs, the crimes, and the heartbreaking final days of Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr., a man who spent his entire life playing a heartless bully just to hide the fact that, in reality, he was the one being hunted by his own shadows. Growing up in Compton, California, during the 1970s meant living in a literal war zone where the darkest hour was a daily, suffocating reality. Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. It was born on June 24, 1958, into a neighborhood being swallowed by the violent rise of street gangs like the Crips and the Bloods. His father was a truck driver and his mother a housewife, but their home could not block the chaos outside. Tommy Lister Jr. went to school with figures like Tookie Williams, the co-founder of the Crips, in an environment so volatile that a campus shootout once left 13 people wounded. It was a place where even the teachers carried firearms for protection, and the sound of gunfire was as common as the school bell. For a young boy born blind in one eye, this was a broken shield existence where survival was the only goal. The turning point for Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. came from the very bullying that threatened to break his spirit. Because of his deformed retina, he was an easy target for neighborhood predators who chased him home almost every day. His mother, tired of seeing her son retreat in fear, eventually forced him to stand his ground and fight back. This shift from victim to defender was the birth of the physical intensity that would later define his acting career. However, instead of joining the gangs he idolized, like the Rolling 60s led by Big U, Tommy Lister Jr. chose the utopian path of athletics. He became a loner who found solace in the weight room. He discovered a natural giant strength within himself, specifically in the Olympic sport of shot put, an event that required massive explosive power and absolute discipline. His athletic journey was a series of record-breaking utopian experiences. After high school, he enrolled at Cal State Los Angeles, where he became a dominant force. He broke the school's shot put record 7 times in a single year, eventually becoming a national champion and earning an induction into the NCAA Division II Hall of Fame. It was during this time that his coach gave him the nickname Tiny, an ironic joke for a man who was 6 feet 5 inches tall and could bench press over 500 pounds. Despite his big voice and terrifying size, he remained a dedicated student athlete, harboring a secret utopian dream that had nothing to do with Hollywood. He wanted to join the Secret Service and spend his life protecting the President of the United States. However, the world saw a different path for a man of his stature. Professional football scouts from the NFL's Los Angeles Rams and the San Francisco 49 ERS began circling the natural giant, convinced that his 275 pounds of muscle belonged on the defensive line. This was a major turning point that could have changed his life forever. But destiny had a cruel, darkest hour waiting. Tommy Lister Jr. suffered a severe leg injury just before his critical tryouts. Combined with what he later described as a bad agent who mismanaged his opportunities, his NFL dreams evaporated. He managed a brief stint in the USFL with the New Orleans Breakers, but he was cut after only 2 games. The broken shield of his sports career left him standing at a crossroads, forced to find a new way to survive. The transition to show business began at the front door of a nightclub. Working as a bouncer, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. met legendary director Walter Hill. Hill saw past the lazy eye and recognized a natural giant with a screen presence that couldn't be taught. He cast Tommy Lister Jr. in a small role in the film Blue City, a move that served as the ultimate turning point for his life's work. But as he began to take acting seriously, he faced a darkest hour within his own home. His parents told him to get a real job and spoke words of failure over him. This created a broken shield of emotional trauma that eventually forced him to walk away from his family to protect his utopian vision of becoming a great actor. He chose his dream over the toxic disbelief of those who should have loved him most. By the late 1980s, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. was a man possessed by a single, desperate ambition: to dominate Hollywood using his massive physical frame as a natural giant. The ultimate turning point arrived when he heard that Vince McMahon was looking for a powerhouse to play the character Zeus, a human wrecking machine, in the film No Holds Barred. To secure the role, Tommy Lister Jr. entered a darkest hour of physical transformation, admitting later that he began using steroids to reach a level of muscularity that was almost superhuman. He went to the audition with a Z shaved into the side of his head and custom-made boots, leaving the producers with no choice but to cast him. This was the birth of his utopian experience in the industry, as he stood toe-to-toe with the legendary Hulk Hogan in a movie that would eventually gross over $100 million worldwide. The transition from the movie screen to the wrestling ring was a turning point that blurred the lines between fiction and reality. Vince McMahon, recognizing the massive popularity of the Zeus character, brought Tommy Lister Jr. into the WWF as Z Gangster. This was a utopian payday, as wrestlers could only earn top-tier money by feuding with Hulk Hogan, and Tommy Lister Jr. was catapulted straight to the main event. However, his arrival created a broken shield of resentment in the locker room. Legends like Andre the Giant were reportedly jealous of this actor who was making massive money without having paid his dues in the wrestling territories. Despite the friction, Tommy Lister Jr. thrived in the spectacle, even when Hulk Hogan accidentally broke his nose during a scene a Darkest Hour that nearly led to a real-life confrontation before the two became close friends over their shared love for James Brown. However, the utopian experience of being a black man at the top of a predominantly white industry brought a chilling Darkest Hour into his personal life. As the character Zeus became a global phenomenon, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. began receiving terrifying death threats from obsessed Hulkamania fans. Even more disturbing was the reaction from the powers that be when Tommy Lister Jr. was offered a $1 million contract to fight outside of the WWF. He later revealed in interviews that once he considered this independent deal, strange and targeted harassment began to occur. He was repeatedly pulled over by police for no reason and threatened by individuals who seemed to have connections to high-level authority. This was a turning point of fear, where the natural giant realized that his fame could not protect him from the broken shield of systemic intimidation. This period was a darkest hour of realization for Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr., as he understood that the showbiz world was far more dangerous than the streets of Compton. He saw how the industry could touch anyone who refused to obey the established rules, forcing him to stay in his lane to survive. This psychological broken shield eventually led to the end of the Zeus character, when Hulk Hogan decided to pull the plug on the project, reportedly due to professional jealousy over how popular the villain had become with the fans. While the utopian run in the wrestling world was over, Tommy Lister Jr. had already established himself as a natural giant who could not be ignored by Hollywood, leading to a massive wave of new roles in films like Universal Soldier and Trespass. Throughout this utopian rise, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. maintained a relentless grinding pace, appearing in television shows and music videos for stars like Michael Jackson. He was a man who had transformed his cursed eye into a utopian blessing, proving his parents' disbelief was wrong with every new contract he signed. He was no longer just the boy from Compton who was chased by bullies. He was a global superstar whose face was on toy store shelves across America. Yet, despite the 250 credits and the millions of dollars flowing in, the darkest hour of his personal life remained. He was a natural giant living in a state of hypervigilance, aware that the same system that gave him fame could take it away in an instant if he stepped out of line. By the mid-1990s, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. was standing on the threshold of his most iconic turning point yet. He had survived the steroids of the wrestling world and the intimidation of the powers that be, and he was now ready to take on a role that would define America's favorite bully for a new generation. The natural giant was about to trade the wrestling ring for the neighborhood streets, bringing a character to life that would make him a household name forever. The broken shield of his past was about to be forged into the iron-fisted legend of DeBo, a role that would bring him his greatest utopian success, but also lead him toward a final darkest hour that no one could have predicted. In 1995, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. reached a turning point that would cement his image in the archives of pop culture forever. Ice Cube was looking for a natural giant to play the role of DeBo, the ultimate neighborhood bully, in a low-budget comedy called Friday. While the producers originally auditioned several professional football players for the part, none of them possessed the seasoned acting ability that Tommy Lister Jr. had honed over a decade in the industry. He brought a big voice and a terrifying physical presence to the role, basing the character's mannerisms on a real-life Compton gang leader named Big U. This was a utopian experience that cost only $3,500,000 to film, but eventually grossed over $30 million, transforming Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. into a household name as the man who could steal a bike or a chain with just a single, menacing stare. The darkest hour of the Friday production was the shoestring budget that forced the actors to work for almost nothing. Ice Cube admitted that the film was a favor from the cast, and many actors, including John Witherspoon, later claimed they received very little compensation for their work. Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. reportedly earned only $20,000 for his iconic performance as DeBo, a broken shield moment for a man who was already a seasoned Hollywood veteran. Yet, the Utopian cultural impact was undeniable. The character of DeBo became so legendary that it transcended the film, making Tommy Lister Jr. a symbol of the neighborhood natural giant that everyone feared but secretly loved to watch. He proved that he didn't need a high-tech costume or special effects. His cursed eye and his massive frame were all he needed to dominate the screen. Following the success of Friday, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. entered a utopian period of non-stop work, proving he was much more than just a street bully. He landed the role of President Lindbergh in the science fiction blockbuster The Fifth Element, starring alongside Bruce Willis and Chris Tucker. This was a massive turning point, as he portrayed the first black president of the galaxy, a natural giant leader with a big voice of authority. He was grinding at an incredible pace, working with rappers like Tupac Shakur in Gang Related, and appearing in music videos for Dr. Dre, Eminem, and Nas. He became the broken shield protector of the hip-hop community, a man who was deeply respected by the hardest artists in the industry because he never forgot his roots in Compton. He was a utopian bridge between the streets and the high-gloss world of Hollywood. However, the darkest hour of his personal life continued to haunt his utopian rise. While the world saw a successful movie star, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. was still dealing with the emotional trauma of his family's disbelief. He remained close to Eazy-E before the rapper's death, but he felt isolated from his own blood relatives who still viewed his career as a gamble. This broken shield of family support led him to find comfort in his work and his faith. He returned for the sequel next Friday in 2000, securing a utopian payday of $250,000, a significant increase from his original salary. He was a man who understood the value of his own brand, refusing to let the industry exploit his natural giant stature without proper compensation. He was finally being paid like the star he had become. By the mid-2000s, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. had achieved a level of success that few black character actors could ever dream of. He appeared in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight as a heroic prisoner, a role that showed the gentle giant side of his persona to a global audience of billions. This was a turning point where he broke the stereotype of the villain, playing a man who chooses to save lives instead of destroying them. But as his utopian career reached its peak, a darkest hour was brewing in the world of real estate. Entangled with crooked lawyers and real estate managers, Tommy Lister Jr. was about to face a broken shield moment that would threaten to take away everything he had worked for since his days in Compton. The natural giant was about to be hunted by the federal government. The investigation into the life of Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. reveals a man who was constantly balancing the utopian highs of Hollywood with the darkest hour of his own mistakes. He was a man of 250 credits, a man of faith, and a man of the people, but he was also a man who was about to lose his freedom. As we move into the final chapters of his story, we see the natural giant struggling to rebuild his reputation after a devastating legal battle, even as his health began to fail him in the shadows. The big voice was still loud, but the broken shield was cracking under the weight of a federal indictment. By 2012, the utopian experience of Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr.'s career hit a devastating turning point that threatened to dismantle his entire legacy. Despite having over 200 acting credits, he found himself at the center of a federal investigation involving a massive mortgage fraud scheme. This was a profound, darkest hour for the man known as DeBo. According to federal prosecutors, Tommy Lister Jr. conspired with a group of crooked real estate managers and lawyers to obtain fraudulent mortgages for 4 luxury homes he could not actually afford. The goal was to siphon off more than $1 million in home equity credit lines based on inflated property values. The total losses to banks and lenders were estimated at a staggering $3,800,000. The natural giant, who had once played a galactic president, was now facing a potential 5-year sentence in federal prison. The broken shield of his personal finances was exposed to the world, revealing that even a high-profile actor could fall victim to predatory associates. Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. eventually pleaded guilty to the conspiracy, taking full responsibility for his actions. He admitted that he had allowed bad people to enter his life and manipulate his utopian success for their own criminal gain. While some official records suggested he avoided lengthy prison time through cooperation and community service, his own cousin, Vincent Brantley, later revealed a much grimmer reality. Brantley claimed that Tommy Lister Jr. did indeed serve between 2 and 3 years behind bars, a darkest hour that stripped him of his wealth and his home. This period of incarceration was a total turning point, forcing the natural giant to strip away the Hollywood ego and find a new purpose within the walls of a cell. This darkest hour in prison led to a powerful spiritual rebirth for Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. He emerged from the experience not as a defeated man, but as a devoted natural giant of faith. He began to view his legal downfall as a broken shield, designed by God to steer him away from the darkest hour of Hollywood greed. Upon his release, he transformed his big voice into a tool for ministry. He began traveling across the country to speak at churches, youth centers, and even back into the prisons where he had once sat. He spoke to gang members in Compton and inmates on death row about the dangers of the darkest hour and the necessity of finding a utopian path through religion. He became a living broken shield for the youth, warning them that even the biggest stars are not above the law. During this same turning point, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. faced a secondary darkest hour involving his physical health. He was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, a condition that forced him to realize that his natural giant frame was not invincible. He began to preach about the importance of health as much as he did about the importance of God, changing his diet and urging his community to take care of their bodies. He saw his diabetes as another broken shield intended to humble him and keep him focused on what truly mattered: his 2 daughters and his service to others. He was no longer just the big voice of DeBo. He was a man who had survived the federal government and his own health crises, coming out on the other side with a utopian sense of peace. Despite the darkest hour of his fraud case, Hollywood did not turn its back on the natural giant forever. Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. slowly began to rebuild his career, taking on voice acting roles in hits like Disney's Zootopia and The Cleveland Show. He also began directing his own independent films alongside his daughter, creating a utopian family business that brought him more joy than the multi-million-dollar blockbusters of his youth. He was grinding harder than ever, trying to pay back the restitution he owed the court while maintaining his broken shield of sobriety and faith. He was a man in the middle of a massive utopian comeback, proving that a turning point toward darkness does not have to be the end of the story. As the year 2020 approached, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. was a man who had successfully navigated the most treacherous, darkest hour of his life. He had survived the streets of Compton, the steroids of the wrestling ring, the corruption of the real estate market, and the isolation of prison. He was a natural giant who had finally found his utopian balance. However, just as he was preparing for his biggest payday, the long-awaited final installment of the Friday series, a new turning point was waiting in the shadows. An invisible enemy was about to create a final darkest hour that would test the broken shield of his health one last time, leading to a conclusion that would shock the world. By the summer of 2020, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. was a man who had survived almost every darkest hour the world could throw at him. He was a natural giant who had successfully conquered the federal courts, the prison system, and a career-threatening fraud case. He was focused on a utopian future, heavily involved in his ministry and preparing for what he believed would be his biggest professional triumph, the final installment of the Friday franchise titled Last Friday. Ice Cube had reportedly structured the movie around the legendary character DeBo, which would have resulted in a utopian payday of nearly $500,000 for Tommy Lister Jr. However, the year 2020 brought a global turning point that no amount of physical strength could overcome. In August, he was diagnosed with COVID-19, a darkest hour that attacked his broken shield of health, which was already compromised by his ongoing battle with type 2 diabetes. Although Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. appeared to beat the initial infection in August, the virus left a broken shield in its wake. He returned to work, but those close to him noticed a decline in the natural giant's legendary energy. The final turning point began in early December 2020. On December 5th, he was scheduled to begin filming a new movie, but for the first time in his 30-year career, he was too weak to show up. He told his friends and his manager, Cindy Cowan, that he felt incredibly weak and was having severe trouble breathing. This was a terrifying darkest hour for a man with such a big voice and a massive frame. Instead of seeking immediate hospital care, he chose to self-quarantine in his Marina del Rey apartment, fearing another positive COVID test and hoping he could simply grind through the pain as he had always done. The days leading up to December 10th were a silent scream of suffering. Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. became so ill that he had to cancel a scheduled virtual appearance for a television festival because he could no longer speak. This was the ultimate, darkest hour for a man whose big voice had defined his life. Concerned for his safety, his manager sent an assistant to his home with vitamins and a Z-Pack, but the natural giant was fading behind locked doors. When he stopped answering phone calls from his family and his two beloved daughters, the broken shield of hope finally shattered. On December 10th, 2020, after a welfare check by the local police, Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. was found dead in his apartment. He was only 62 years old, a natural giant silenced by a combination of natural causes and the lingering, brutal effects of the pandemic. The news of his death was a turning point of grief for the entire entertainment industry. Ice Cube led the tributes, calling him a born entertainer and America's favorite bully who was actually a gentle giant at heart. The utopian dream of the last Friday movie was suddenly hollow, as the man who was supposed to be its center was gone. As the investigation into his death concluded, it was revealed that Tommy Lister Jr. had been working on a book to tell his full story, a broken shield of truth that would have detailed his journey from the streets of Compton to the heights of Hollywood. He died just as he was achieving the spiritual and financial stability he had fought for since his darkest hour in federal prison. He died as he lived, a man of faith who refused to let his weaknesses define his natural giant spirit. As we reflect on the final breath of Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr., we see a man who successfully turned every darkest hour into a turning point for growth. He took a blind eye and made it a blessing. He took a prison sentence and made it a ministry. And he took a neighborhood bully and made him a beloved icon. The natural giant may have left the physical world in a lonely apartment, but he left behind a utopian legacy of over 250 roles that will ensure his big voice is never truly forgotten. The silent scream of his final days has been replaced by the cheers of millions of fans who will always remember DeBo, Zeus, and the man who was simply tiny. The final turning point in the story of Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. is the enduring legacy of a man who spent his life proving that a perceived curse can be transformed into a global blessing. He was a natural giant who broke every stereotype of the Hollywood villain, showing the world that behind the scowl of DeBo and the rage of Zeus was a heart dedicated to faith and family. His journey from the violent streets of Compton to the highest levels of show business serves as a utopian roadmap for any young person struggling with their own darkest hour. He proved that physical limitations, family disbelief, and even a criminal record do not have to be the end of the story. By the time of his passing, he had built a broken shield of resilience that protected his spirit until his very last breath, leaving behind a body of work that spans over 250 credits. The utopian experience of his influence is most visible in the way he changed the perception of character actors in Hollywood. Tommy Lister Jr. was not just a sidekick. He was a natural giant, whose presence made every film more memorable. Whether he was terrifying audiences in a comedy or saving lives in a superhero blockbuster, he brought a big voice of authenticity that resonated with people from all walks of life. His legacy is also deeply rooted in his work with the youth and the incarcerated. He used his own darkest hour in federal prison as a turning point to reach those who had been forgotten, offering them a broken shield of hope through his ministry. He showed that true strength is measured by the number of people you can lift up. In the years since his death on December 10th, 2020, the world has come to appreciate the natural giant even more. The silent scream of his lonely passing has been replaced by a chorus of gratitude from fans who were touched by his kindness. While the last Friday movie may never be completed in the way it was originally intended, the character of DeBo remains a utopian icon of black cinema. Tommy "Tiny" Lister Jr. lived a life that was a constant series of turning points, moving from a blind child in a war zone to a national champion, a wrestling superstar, a federal inmate, and finally, a man of God. He proved that the darkest hour is often just the prelude to a new dawn. As we close this investigation, we see a man who was simply too big for the boxes the world tried to put him in. He was a gentle giant who used his big voice to speak truth, and his trademark eye to see the beauty in a world that had once been so cruel to him. He survived the streets, the industry, and the law, only to find peace in his own skin. Rest in peace, Tommy Tiny Lister Jr. The neighborhood is a little quieter without DeBo, but the world is a lot brighter because you were in it. The contract is finished, the grind is over, and the gentle giant has finally gone home to the utopian peace he so richly deserved.